Welcome to Keep Writing. I'm James. Today I've got a book review of a writer's guide that I think most people probably have not seen. I don't remember how I found this book, quite honestly. I think it was through a podcast that I came across, but it's a fiction writer's guide to peace by Gabrial Ertsgaard. And the subtitle is Crafting Nonviolent Heroism. Now, you might ask yourself, if you've listened to me at all, why would a writer of military science fiction, space opera, writing stories that typically have some kind of military aspect to them, based on the fact that I'm a veteran and I write a lot about that, what it's like to be a veteran, why would I want to read or why would I look to a guide to incorporating peace in stories? There are a lot of reasons for that. Among my peers, I have heard the complaint many times, God, I can't write another space battle. Or if I have to write another battle in a corridor, I'm going to go crazy. Or I get tired of motivations that I think of as the easy button. And by easy button, I mean the character is faced with a problem. They need to solve it because they happen to be a soldier, or, they have weapons. In this future, they're all carrying blasters or whatever. Violence is always a possibility. I think because of that, a lot of stories don't engage with what it really means to deal with violence, to deal with the idea of getting hurt or the people around you getting hurt, having to live with the idea that you're going to have to go do something that could hurt you, if not kill you. A lot of people really don't know what it's like to live that way or to have that stress hanging over you all the time. And it's real. Every time I hear people talking about Civil War, I just think you don't even know what you're talking about. So this, to me, was just intriguing. I wasn't sure what direction the author was going to take. I wasn't sure how useful it might be, but I found this book to be incredibly useful. And the biggest takeaway I would offer to anyone who's looking for how to deepen their characters or how to deepen their characters tied to plot, this book is really a wealth of ideas in that way. It really gets into different types of plots, different kinds of world building, character motives, and methods that can drive action without being violent or seeking to use violence as the tool to get through the story. And so I just think that's a wealth. The book is full of a wealth of ideas on how to subvert reader expectations. Since I just did a video talking about Matt Dinniman's Dungeon Crawler Carl, I realized through reading this book that there's a great example of reconciliation, a nonviolent response to a situation in book 2, Carl's Doomsday Scenario. I don't want to spoil too many things, but Carl comes across, or basically gets involved with, a side quest that has a cursed circus, and the ringmaster of the circus kind of has everyone trapped. And there's another character, a demon, who it really looks like everything is pushing Carl and Donut toward some sort of, battle with the ringmaster. Like the only way they're going to be able to solve this problem is to get in there and kill the guy. And so Carl, and that's the way that the story could have gone. Probably still would have been satisfying, would have been fine. But Carl chooses to find a different solution that does not employ violence. I may be forgetting some details. There may have been some violence in there, but overall, it was a nonviolent solution by reconciling these two characters. And this is book 2 in the series. You're still getting to know Carl in a lot of ways. You're getting to know how the dungeon they live in, they're dealing with, works. And when Carl puts a lot of effort into doing this, it sets Carl up as a character who is not going to try and solve all his problems using the rules of the dungeon, which are violence and killing. And that takes the series in it doesn't take it in a different direction, but I think the reader sees that, and after getting through that process with the character, realizes this is a different story than you might have thought it was going to be. This is a different character than you thought it was going to be. And maybe Carl is going to pull this off, that he could defeat this entire system and rescue the people that he wants to rescue. So the thing that I liked a lot about this book, well, hey, it has a lot of examples. So every time you think that, well, I don't think that would really work, or I don't think that's really out there in popular fiction, Ertsgaard just has, example after example after example. A lot of them are from movies and TV. I think that was probably a choice because just a lot of people haven't read, maybe many of the books that are using this kind of plot technique. There are one example of an anthology that has some stories in it that he uses. And then other examples like MASH or Disney's Frozen. I hadn't thought about Frozen as actually having a nonviolent plot solution to it. A Christmas Carol is a character transformation story that, I mean, I don't know that Scrooge ever had the means to kill the ghosts, but it probably could have gone different ways if he didn't look inside himself and choose to change versus just double down and continue being the jerk that he was. The thing I want to say about this book, too, to start with, is that it's very academic. It was published by an academic press, Bloomsbury. It's written in a way that might turn off people that are used to reading other writer's guides. And I'll be honest, I don't finish a lot of writer's guides. They tend to be, I feel like they're pretty fluffy. I feel like they're often aimed at people that the author thinks have never picked up a pen before, have never written a story, are not looking for things to expand the knowledge they already have. It's like they think that they're talking to somebody that just walked in from the street. And so finding a book that is at that 400 level that already makes those assumptions that how to do these things. It's just a matter of like, give me some new ideas. And so I really appreciated that about the book. I also think it's an honest book. One of the things about, I guess, this type of audience, or somebody might come into this and think, well, that will never work. Like, violence is the only solution. Power is the only thing people respect. And maybe at a base level, that is true. But when you start getting into more advanced societies that have things like economics and power dynamics and politics, a lot more comes into play. And yes, you could always revert to, and then I started spraying, but that's not super interesting, right? So that's a thing the book is engaged with. But in the introduction, a lot of time is spent on, is this really a problem? Like, people say that there's a lot of violence in stories. We say that rap music is going to, subvert our kids, and so will violent video games. But is it really a problem? So he spends time engaging with that. There are some cites some research that was done, and really is pushing on his own idea, and then also asking the question, like, can these stories even be compelling? He doesn't outright ask the question, will these stories sell? But to me, those are kind of tied together. Like, it's very rare that a non-compelling or non-interesting book will sell a lot of copies, right? I do have some questions or thoughts about how these ideas might work against existing tropes that I'll get into. But I really like that the book is willing to even question its own assumption. So having worked through that and given the reader enough information, I think, to make their own decision to keep moving with the book, the second chapter does jump into a history of what Ertsgaard calls peace poetics, which would be people that are already studying this as a concept, looking at ways that, peace and striving toward peace can be incorporated into our lives, into our politics, and where it has appeared in story. And then talking about different ways that peace poetics, appear in stories, conflict resolution, character transition, things like that. And civil resistance was another big piece of it. That was an interesting chapter. I did sort of want to jump right into the character stuff, which he gets into in chapter 3, but I still found the history interesting. And this is where one of the first places where Ertsgaard goes in depth on an example that then leads to each chapter has an exercise at the end. And that's the other thing I think about this book, is that it would be really, it's a very useful book for a writer's group or a classroom where people are exploring these ideas, and then it gives them something concrete to work with. So the exercises are individual. I mean, they give you things to talk about. I think you could do that in your group to brainstorm different ideas that might solve the problem. And they're all kind of character problems, but then it gives you things to go away with and then come back to the group and, share and talk about the things that, the ways that you might have answered that problem. So third chapter is character arcs. And that might seem simple, like, okay, we all know what a character arc is, but viewing it from the lens of nonviolence, like especially in an action driven story, and I think that's the angle I'm coming from, because if you write romance, and I have some thoughts about this, but you might say just initially, well, violence doesn't come into my stories. And I might say, well, interpersonal violence might come in there, like oftentimes abuse is a driver, or your inciting incident or your character background, abuse could very much be part of that. And then the ways that they respond to abuse and violence can motivate that character later on. That could actually work into character transition as characters make decisions, not to do things. I would also say that with any military science fiction story, any space opera story that has a war in it, which is many of them, the action, the fighting, the battles, the building out of fleets and, character units and people in the military, that's all part of it. Like we think about Battlestar Galactica, and what it is, but then think about all the side plots that take place in a really rich story, like all the different aspects of that event that are being shown from different angles by different characters. And that's where I think this information really can help deepen stories and make them more interesting, because it makes the world more alive when, not everybody's always on board with a war. I went through the build up to Iraq. I have very different ideas now at this point in my life. Anytime somebody starts, rattling the saber and saying, let's go to war, I just remember what things were like back in 2000 going into, 2002, and all the rhetoric that was used and the misstatements and, the ways the public was deceived and the ways that protesters against that were just sort of ridiculed because everybody pulled together because of 9/11. And I absolutely think that was one of the greatest times in our country, when everybody pulled together. But then what we did with that was not great, in my opinion. And so the people that had the courage to stand up and ask to seek for a nonviolent resolution, or ask our government to consider peace as a way forward, I think there's a lot of courage and there's a lot of struggle in those decisions. And adding that to your book can just make that conflict so much more rich. It can give your main characters who might be involved in the fighting ideas to struggle with when you're deploying for a war, and you're thinking in the back of your mind about maybe information somebody gave you about different options or ways that this could be resolved. That gives your characters so much to chew on. And not that you want them, perseverating the whole time and boring the reader with their constant thoughts or worries about what they're going to do, but it gives them different options in their tool book, right? And then the thing I say a lot is that I want to see characters with tools, either learn those tools and then use them effectively. Like that's what makes, for me, a satisfying story. And so this is, I think, just can be a very useful idea for people to consider. So character arcs gets into, background on how characters change, how different types of change can work in a nonviolent fashion. Here, Ertsgaard also continues to touch on the fact that, violence happens. These characters are going to be potentially around violence, responding to violence, but they can make different choices. And taking it seriously is something the author has to think about. Like, is the idea of nonviolence even an option? And so later chapters get into world building. The idea that if we're going to make piece even plausible. Like sometimes it has to be baked into the world. And this is one place where I think the book, is aimed at a bit of a mainstream reader, because there is a history of this in science fiction that, and I'm pretty sure that Ertsgaard is aware of this, but the book just doesn't mention, Ursula K. Le Guin, Clifford Slimak, Octavia Butler, Stanislaw Lem. I mean, most lately, Becky Chambers and the Robot and Monk series. A lot of authors have explored this space in science fiction. I think science fiction makes it easier because, we think about a milieu story or an idea story that's driven by, let's imagine a different society, or let's imagine a world where characters can make different decisions based on changes in technology or, changes to the worlds that they live in. And so a place where very attenuated responses to something could be very interesting, and nonviolence could be a part of that. Cordwainer Smith, one of his most famous lines is that I think the aliens tell the humans something like, you can do anything, but you cannot kill, or you do not have the right to judge. And it just blows this character's mind. Like, how am I going to respond to something if I can't do it? If I can't go beat them bloody, right? So world building, this gives a lot of tools to kind of think about it as building your world building. And it uses Solarpunk as an example, but there are a lot of different other ways in Solarpunk. Like, Solarpunk is almost sort of the easy button when it comes to things like this, because it's baked into the aesthetic of that subgenre. So this is a place where I would have liked to have seen the book explore more like other genres. Like, I would have liked to have seen how this might work with mystery or thriller. Going back to character transitions and character arcs, I would have liked to have seen how it could work more with romance, where I think romance is very strict. A lot of people don't realize from the outside, but readers come to romance with very set expectations about what the story is going to do and how their characters are going to act. They want to see the meet cute. They want to see the run through the rain. They want to see the friends to enemies. And they like it when that trope exists, but is subverted in some way. Like, that's what makes the story more interesting. So how could these ideas be incorporated into what can be a very rigid set of tropes and plots? And there's a lot of tools here to do this. I think it just explicitly, Ertsgaard isn't talking about those genres. So also some time is given to other types of plots that could be used. Ideas like journeys or campaigns. In science fiction, I think of that as like the wonder aspect, the exploring aspect, which is just a big part of any science fiction story for me. Like, I love the sense of wonder. I want to see characters who are exploring, going out into new places. I want to see what the author imagined, and I want to see the characters respond to that new place. And so this plays pretty easily into that, but it's one of the ideas Ertsgaard didn't come up with, but shares. A duel can be used in a lot of ways as a path toward character reconciliation. And he's got some examples from Star Trek, and it made me think about, like, this is kind of a trope in Star Trek where quite often there'll be some conflict the characters are dealing with, often involving aliens, and our heroes get caught up in the problem and then find themselves in an alien court and have to argue for why they think something is good or bad. Like, I think about the interactions between Picard and Q. And so how can a very underpowered character argue or use their tools, as a person to find conflict resolution to solve a problem? That may not be, what everybody wants, but they end up getting through that. And so when you're reading that character, you get to see Picard, make an awesome speech, and you get to see other characters, trying to support that and do their best, or make the choice, not to respond in a violent manner. And Star Trek, I think, is just one of the largest examples of nonviolence always being an ideal. But they have to revert to violence a lot. It really speaks to, speak softly but carry a big stick. I think when looking back at Star Trek, like, I can't pull a lot of them off the top of my mind, but I think that Gene Roddenberry certainly had these ideas as an ideal. And so it's pretty easy to see, where it is. Negotiations as a plot technique can be very interesting, like have a lot of interesting character interactions. that's where you can have, going back to Carl and Donut in Dungeon Crawler Carl, like a lot of their dialogue interactions are negotiations. Like Carl is trying to convince Donut of something. Donut wants to do it her way. They have to find a solution between them. And Carl could get mad and flip the table. And he does think about that quite often. But then he also thinks through the ramifications of if he does that. And he often always comes back to the fact that he loves Donut. He cares about Donut. He cannot leave. It's part of his character that he cannot leave the people he cares about behind. And will that be his fatal flaw? Like, we don't know until the end of the story, right? But that's one of the plot ideas that are in there. A caper story. So the Ocean's 11 series is talked about as a way to build up conflict that can drive the plot. Underdogs versus a powerful figure. I think this is probably the first one people will point to as, well, that'll never work. I mean, in the real world, that'll never work. And that's probably true. That's why you got to think about world building. But I think that's where the idea of hope comes into play. And there's a lot of ideas here on just how to approach that and think about it. So, especially with, I think, a story where the reader expects there to be a violent solution, it's a really useful thing to think about. So, other ideas, I think there is kind of a tension in this book that I noticed where I think it's trying to give advice to what I would call a normie like me. Like, I'm not a person that thinks a lot about, I hadn't thought a lot about nonviolence in stories. Like, as I was reading through a lot of these examples, I did find myself going, oh yeah, I've seen that. But I think it's also trying to talk to an audience that is already trying to do this, that has already been trying to, push forward these ideas either through, I see this a lot in comics. I think it's in graphic novels. I feel like it's a lot more prevalent where, writers just quite often are a lot more polemical. And that happens on both sides. Like, you can read, especially in military science fiction, you'll be reading a book and it just becomes the author's diatribe on, being a libertarian or something. And like, okay, yeah. I didn't start reading this book for a political science, lecture, but there are ways to do it that are more interesting than others, right? and so I think it can work both ways there. So Ertsgaard spends some time talking about, like, why try to tell stories at all? Why use fiction at all if your goal is to really just cut to the chase and tell people this is what they should be doing? Like, hey, dummy, violence is stupid. And like, yeah, we know that. I would hope people know that. It can be interesting. It has been a part of our history. It challenges us. I mean, think about football as, a national event we have that is essentially ritualized violence, but we don't think about it that way always. And so as more information comes out about traumatic brain injury, and we come out of the global war on terrorism and we have a lot more information about traumatic brain injury, football will probably change. Like, I don't think the NFL is going to become a bunch of people, negotiating in lounge chairs, but there are ways that the game could change to still be interesting and still be exciting. But maybe we're not going to slam into each other as hard as we have in the past, right? I don't know that boxing will ever change, but maybe in a world like Tron, where we can go virtual, you could still make it interesting. And that's also something that is pretty prevalent in science fiction, where you've got stand-ins for violence, between virtual worlds and robots and, things of that nature, mental fights that can happen, like mental strength. I suppose that gets into like interpersonal violence, but there are other ways to do this. There are other ways to get the point across that are still interesting and still keep people engaged. And so I feel like the book is talking to some of those people as well. There are later chapters that really get into just more the academic side and some of what's happening in think tanks and different nonprofits as they're, working to get these ideas out into the world. It touches on a tendency to have very rigid definitions of certain words and how that can, basically become in-group language that makes it pretty hard for outsiders or, normies to engage with those ideas. And so, Ertsgaard just says, like, hey, we we should be careful of that. Like, how can you make the stories engaging for people? How can you give them characters to love that still hopefully get them to think about the ideas that you're trying to bring to the surface? I mean, even within different groups, he talks about how they use words in different ways, and you can have two groups that are both pulling for the same goal, but they'll kind of use this. I mean, he uses the word purity. You know, they'll basically get in conflict about who's more pure here. But ultimately, if your goal is to persuade people, then doing it in a way that is accessible and interesting can be more effective. I think is what is where he's going with it. So that chapter also had what I felt were very deep topics that it kind of glosses over. And so, like a lot of this book, it's heavily footnoted. I think that's one of a strength of it as well. Every time you get to a source that is explored or some idea that is explored, and you're kind of like, huh, I'd like to read more about that, or I'd like to go look at that, the footnote is there. So you can go in and find it. The anthology that is referenced is out there for free. So let's see, that one was The Weight of Light, a collection of solar futures. It was published by Arizona State University. I'll put the link in the show notes. I haven't gone back and read it myself, but at least the examples looked interesting. I think it's got a story by Cat Rambo in it as well. And then another one was a few examples from a magazine published between 2013 and 2016 called Fantasy Scroll that I had never heard of. And the examples at least sound very interesting. That one is archived and available for free on the publisher's website, or I think the editor's website. So I'll link to that one as well. Like, I think there's probably 20 issues that are available. So that's cool, because that gets into probably my largest criticism of this book is that it's expensive. It's published by an academic publisher. I think it's aimed at the academic market, probably trying to sell this to college classes. And if you're a professor and you're listening to me right now, I think it's probably worth it. I think this is a book that deserves to be purchased. I always hate it. I mean, maybe in the realm of academic books, this is actually cheap, but the cover price on the paperback is $30. The ebook ranges between 30 and 26. So for me, that is not an impulse purchase. That book better have some pretty useful stuff in it for me to spend $30 on it. Pretty much anything, if I'm going to spend that much money on it. I think the value I got out of this book is definitely, it's up there, but that's still a lot. If you're a librarian, I think this would be a valuable addition to any library, and I would recommend that libraries pick it up. But I think this book, I mean, I would hope that at some point a less expensive edition comes out that might be aimed at more of the commercial market. I mean, the cover is also not doing it a whole lot of favors. It's a book about peace, and it has a very peaceful and calming cover, which that's fine. But if it's trying to compete on Amazon, it's probably going to have a harder pull than some other books. So those are just some of the things, and that's obviously not Ertsgaard's fault. So I think the other piece I wanted to say was that I don't know if Ertsgaard has the option to do this, and I would highly recommend making some kind of workbook tied to this, to A Fiction Writer's Guide to Peace. It seems like that's a thing that writers groups could purchase for a more reasonable price that gives them the exercises, and then they could work right there with the exercises. And the organization of the book, I think, is like some of the order of the chapters. Maybe I probably would have started with world building and then got into character, but I can see where the decisions were made there. But the exercises are kind of spread throughout the book. And I did find myself, paging back and forth a lot because I wanted to look at the exercises. I hate to write in books, but I'm trying to force myself to do it more, actually. But I marked where the exercises were. So I think if I had a workbook that had all of those in one place and I could find them easily, that's a thing I definitely would buy, especially if it was less than, say $10, which is absolutely a thing that's pretty easy to set up on Amazon. And I've done it. My novel outlining guide, like I keep it at $5 because actually that's the lowest price I can make it. And I buy it and use it. So that's why I did that. And I don't make any money off that. but it can certainly be done. So, and I think still make, you know, make a profit off it, which I hope Ertsgaard is making something out of this. So looking back at my notes here, I think I covered just about everything. The last thing I wanted to think about, and I kind of touched on this with romance, but the book does use a lot of examples. Like Frozen is pretty current. And it's still, I want to say it's almost 10 years old now, if not more. I would have liked to have seen how some of the examples might play with newer genres and newer subgenres that are coming up that are especially the cozy genres. So things like, farm simulators or farming, cultivation fantasy, slice of life, stories that are explicitly low conflict. Because I don't think a low conflict story, and honestly, I haven't read a lot in this genre. I've played some of the video games, so I don't want to speak too heavily about it, but it might be harder for a low conflict stories to still drive at some of the things I think arguments that Ertsgaard's been making for how a character seeking a nonviolent solution or being a nonviolent hero, that's not a low conflict situation. And I've mentioned on that a few times, like having to stand up against your culture, the threat of being ostracized, or the ego death of going through a character change of that type and becoming a new person. That is not low conflict. so so I'd be curious how it would fit into that. Stories that more lit RPG that maybe have, more repetition maybe in how the quests work, complex game mechanics where, finding a nonviolent solution. Like I'm thinking about the Ace Lawyer games where you basically are choosing between different options on how to get through. It's been a while since I played those, but Fallout New Vegas, like that's a big part of the role playing in that game. And with any role playing game, thinking through this now, like, yeah, any RPG that gives the option of giving the character a lot of charisma and intelligence against the violent solution. I don't think those two things are opposed to each other. New Vegas has a lot of non-violent options to get through a given quest line. So that's a thing that I think definitely could play into lit RPG. I felt like this book, and this is a line I don't want to lose, because this is a book that isn't telling people not to fight. It's not telling writers that they should try to write stories where nobody is in struggle. It's that there are different ways to fight. It's expanding the idea of what it is to fight, to stand up against something, to solve a problem, to solve something within the character's self that needs to be resolved or with someone else. That's still a conflict. That's still a fight to be had. Maybe the tools they're using are not guns, right? Or killing people. And oftentimes, when characters survive, that's a whole lot harder than just getting rid of somebody you don't want to deal with. And you see authors do that sometimes. That's the easy button again, right? And also, if you're an author working today, killing a really compelling bad guy is kind of bad for business. I think about Black Panther and how I really wish they hadn't. That was a whole Dark Brother timeline of, Marvel does it all the time where there'll be a fight between the hero and somebody who was like a lieutenant or a family member or another member of the team. It seems like they're not, like, think about Batman versus Superman, right? And then they have their battle and they work out their beef and then they choose to move forward together. And now they're stronger because they have worked out, we get to see how awesome they are against each other. And we also know that one can't necessarily be stronger than another. Captain America versus Thor, that kind of thing. But when you kill off your bad guy, now you can't use them. And unfortunately, tragically, Black Panther is one where absolutely would have loved to seen the series continue, but unfortunately we don't get to have that. So it's something to think about there. And this is an option that can help keep those people in the story and give options for later books and continuation in the series. I would recommend this book. It's a hard sell at $30. I just have a hard time, especially for somebody who is starting out. I'll link to some other things that are available that Ertsgaard has written that get to some of the ideas in the book. I'll link to some of Ertsgaard's essays that, or at least one essay that touch on some of the ideas that are used in the book that's available. But I think there's a lot to learn from this book. So I would recommend it. And I think for anybody who's also looking for different character motivations or wants to be able to view and understand stories in a different way, I think this book is going to give you a lot of tools to do that. So again, this was A Fiction Writer's Guide to Peace, Crafting Nonviolent Heroism by Gabrial Ertsgaard, and it was published by the Bloomsbury Academic Press, and they are at bloomsbury.com. So, all right, thanks for hanging out with me, and I will see you next time. Thanks.